Nikki's sweater is finished, so I've mocked up a copy of the neckline on her sweater. I measure the neckline on the front and on the back. The center back stitches are sitting on scrap yarn. Our center stitch is still on a holder. I use stitch markers to help me pick up stitches evenly around the neck. I'm going to pick up both legs of the stitch, not just one, at the very edge of the neckline. Wrap the yarn counterclockwise. I'll count the stitches along this section, figure out how many picked up stitches I need in that section, and the difference tells me how many stitches to skip when picking up. When I reach the live stitches in the back, I start at the farthest live stitch and gently slide them onto the other needle. I can then knit those stitches and then go back to picking up. If you come to an edge stitch that is a little loose, don't pick up through the big hole. You'll just make it bigger. Pick up through a tighter stitch right next to it. You'll close up the hole. Now we're picking up along the front of the V-neck. We've reached the center front stitch sitting on a holder. I will slip this stitch on the pickup row. Then continue picking up, leaving the stitch marker on. After I finish the pickup row, I count stitches on the back to be sure I've picked up the right number, and on both sides of the front to be sure they are the same. I've finished picking up and I'm on the first round of knitting, so I start with the purl 2, then knit 2, and so on. As I work around the back neck and approach the left shoulder, I stop and count the stitches to be sure I will finish the back with a whole number of pattern repeats. I've worked my ribbing pattern around almost to the center stitch. I'll go back over the front of the V to be sure I've maintained my ribbing pattern correctly. One stitch before the center stitch, I start the double decrease. Slip the center stitch and the stitch before it together knitwise. Knit the next stitch and then pass the 2 slip stitches over the knit stitch. This creates a raised stitch in the center. I worked 2 purl stitches before the double decrease, so I'll work 2 purl stitches after the center stitch and continue my ribbing. I'm approaching the right shoulder seam, which is the end of the first round. Again, I'll count the stitches that are left. I knit the last 2 stitches of the round and just continue on to the next round, starting with the purl 2. We've worked the ribbing around to the center stitch. Here's another double decrease. Slip the center stitch and the stitch before it together knitwise. Knit 1, pass the slip stitches over the knit stitch. And continue the ribbing pattern. Here's the center stitch with 1 purl stitch on each side, then 2 knit stitches, and so on. I've worked about 1 inch of ribbing. You can see the raised center stitch more clearly here and the angle formed by the decreased stitches. At the beginning of a round, we start binding off in pattern, which means to work the pattern stitch on the bind off row rather than knitting every stitch. Our round started with the purl 2, so I purl 2 again and bind off 1 stitch. The next stitch is a knit stitch, so I knit 1 and bind off. I knit another stitch and bind off, then back to purl. I'll continue on a round in the knit 2, purl 2, binding off. The center stitch is bound off with a knit stitch. When I've bound off the entire neckline and have 1 stitch left, I'll look at the back of the work to find the first bound off stitch. I'm going to knit through the first leg of that stitch and bind off my last stitch over the first stitch in the round. I cut my yarn and pull it through. I thread my yarn tail through a darning needle, Now I'm going to find the second bound off stitch and just follow it with my needle. This creates an invisible join at the end of the round. I'll weave this end in on the inside of the ribbing. We have a knit 2, purl 2 neck ribbing that matches the ribbing at the hem. Next, we'll work a round neck ribbing. This is a mock-up of the round neck I've worked in previous videos with stitches on a holder in the front and back. I'll be knitting the neck ribbing in a contrasting color. I measure the front and place markers to help me pick up stitches evenly. Using a crochet hook is another way to pick up stitches. Use a hook the same size or slightly smaller than your knitting needle. Put the hook under the entire first stitch. Grab the yarn and pull it through. Wrap the yarn counterclockwise, which is the opposite of how you normally crochet. After 10 stitches or so, I slide them onto my knitting needle. Now I've reached the back neck with live stitches on a scrap yarn. I'll put the live stitches onto the left needle, starting at the farthest stitch from my right needle, so the last stitch I slide onto the left needle is closest to my right needle and ready to be worked. I'll knit the stitches I just slid onto the needle. I'll go back to picking up stitches with my crochet hook and slide the previous stitches down the cable to get the needle out of the way. Here I'm sliding the center front stitches from the scrap yarn. You can leave the stitches on the yarn as you pick them up. I knit the stitches I've just put on the left needle. I pick up the last of the stitches up the right shoulder and slide them onto the needle. At the right shoulder, I start a knit 1, purl 1 ribbing. I've completed one round of ribbing, and I'll continue to work the knit 1, purl 1 ribbing for about an inch. Here I've worked about an inch of ribbing and am at the end of a round. Now I'll bind off in pattern. The pattern is knit 1, purl 1, so I'll knit 1 stitch, then purl 1, then bind off a stitch. The next stitch in the pattern is a knit, so I'll knit 1, then bind off, then purl 1 and bind off, then back to knit, and so on. Binding off in pattern gives a nicer look to the bound off edge. I'll finish the round the same as on the V-neck by working the first stitch of the round and binding off, then cutting my thread, pulling it through, and weaving it to resemble a stitch. The neckline is finished. All that's left is to weave in the ends and block your sweater. I hope you've enjoyed my videos. Don't worry about taking notes. I've put the entire system into an ebook available at knitsweaterpattern.com. Congratulations and thanks for watching. Stay tuned.